They have problems in Syria. They lost several caliphs over the last couple of months, so they have leadership issue.
What are the strengths of ISIS right now?
Well, the Islamic State has been really successful, as did Al-Qaeda, and we can talk about them in a minute, to exploit problems with governance, instability, communal violence, economic deprivation in Africa.
Where does Al-Qaeda stand right now?
The reason why AQAP is weakened was not just the leadership attrition, is that they got ground down in this horrific war that's been going on in Yemen over the last couple of years.
Is there a chance that either of these organizations, ISIS or Al-Qaeda, poses any kind of threat to launch an attack in the West and specifically in the United States at this stage?
Oh, they're very much working on it, but in a different way than we traditionally think about this.
We're about halfway through the year, and every year it's important from my perspective to take a look at where the extremist groups stand in terms of what they're doing, what their strength is, what kind of activities they've been engaged in, because I think it's important to keep the focus on them, even though we seem to have drifted away from that a bit. So the first question I'd like to ask you is, let's take a look at ISIS, and can you give us a sense of what their weaknesses are right now?
Thank you so much. Always good to be with you. Weaknesses with ISIS at the moment is really hard to define, right? So obviously, it's very much been in the media. They have problems in Syria. They lost several caliphs over the last couple of months, so they have a leadership issue in Syria. There's also been a lull in their attacks in Syria after they had a lot of attacks the first quarter of 2023. However, overall, and that is true for ISIS and Al-Qaeda, the focus, the activities, and the influence of those groups has shifted to a certain extent away from the Middle East, their traditional playground, or even Afghanistan, where it's still a looming but not yet actualized terror structure, towards Africa, where there is spectacular success for ISIL, in particular the Islamic State West Africa province and the Islamic State Greater Sahara province in the western parts of Africa. But also the new affiliate, the Islamic State Central Africa, is doing very well as well. So there, to talk about weakness when they are now controlling large amounts of territory would be a fallacy. So yes, the traditional playground, they are weaker than they were last year. But in Africa, they definitely gained strength.
Well, what are the strengths? That's another question I want to ask you separately. What are the strengths of ISIS right now?
Well, the Islamic State has been really successful, as did Al-Qaeda, and we can talk about them in a minute, to exploit problems with governance, instability, communal violence, economic deprivation in Africa. If we were talking 2 years ago even, there was a terrorism problem in West Africa, the Sahel region. There was a problem in Somalia. Now, I would argue to a certain extent, that terrorism problem got a little bit out of control. You have 20% around of Nigeria being no-go areas de facto for the Nigerian army, although they're starting to fight back. You have parts of Mali, no-go areas for the Mali coup government that is run by the Islamic State Greater Sahara. So much so that their area of operation is now touching with the Al-Qaeda coalition, JINIM. And last month, we just put out a report of that. Last month, we had the first serious clashes between those terror organizations on controlling territory. So they took, it wasn't necessarily the strength of those organizations, it was the weakness of governments in that region that was taken really advantage of, and very successfully, plus the sometimes voluntary, sometimes forced withdrawal of our forces, primarily the French forces in Africa, gave them more breathing room, and they used that.
So let's take the same look at Al-Qaeda right now. A few years ago, there was a group called AQAP that everybody thought was the leading edge of the Al-Qaeda movement. I know that they've lost a number of key important people. They seem to have at that time, say more than a decade ago, this ability to produce very sophisticated bombs, or at least bombs that we weren't familiar with. Where does Al-Qaeda stand right now in terms of what it's capable of and what it is able to do?
So Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, was never the largest, as far as numbers is concerned, affiliate. It was, as you pointed out, the smartest, in inverted comma, affiliate. And for a number of years after the early 2000s, it seemed that the Al-Qaeda global network had essentially outsourced innovation and attacks abroad to AQAP. So, for example, you had the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris. That was AQAP organizing them. You had the ability to put explosive materials in laptops, which forced all of us to put our laptops into the checked-in luggage for a while, a couple of years ago. Now, good for us, not so good for Yemen, because the reason why AQAP is weakened was not just the leadership attrition, is that they got ground down in this horrific war that's been going on in Yemen over the last couple of years. So they lost really their ability, at least for now. We never know when the situation stabilizes again, and AQAP have the ability to really integrate with some of the tribes in Yemen. They may yet come back, but for the time being, the combination of removal of leadership and being in a war situation where essentially everyone killed everyone else in Yemen for the last years really diminished their abilities. However, we have, with the new Al-Qaeda coalition formed in 2017 in Jinim in West Africa, now a coalition of various Al-Qaeda groups that used to be all under the umbrella of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, having come back together, formed that coalition, and now running about, optimistic sources say 40%, pessimistic sources say up to 70% of Burkina Faso, a very significant sized country. On the west coast and on the east coast, you had already traditionally the largest in number Al-Qaeda affiliate called Al-Shabaab. At the moment, the threat from Al-Shabaab to take over Somalia is primarily kept in check by the African Transition Mission in Somalia, with a capital T, and the transition is supposed to be happening next year, 2024. So they may actually get also, again, stronger and the ability to control Somalia, which, by the way, as we all know from the piracy issue a couple of years ago, lies right next to a very significant shipping lane. So that is a real concern. Plus, of course, there's always Afghanistan. And we do not see at all, in any way, shape, or form, that the Taliban have in any way controlled or hold Al-Qaeda back. It's very comfortably protected by the Taliban right now. The various affiliates in the country are rebuilding their capabilities. The foreign fighters, either non-Afghan Al-Qaeda linked fighters, are now part of the Taliban special forces in the country. And Pakistan is already paying the price by seeing 100% more attacks this year than last year, and last year was more than the 2021, and so on. So they're already permeating out of Afghanistan. So I wouldn't argue that Afghanistan is done in that respect. Everyone knows ISKP, Islamic State Khorasan province, that certain parts of it are fighting the Taliban, others are trying to talk to the Haqqani network in the Taliban. So they're not out either. And the Taliban, as we have discussed many, many times, neither have the capability nor the ultimate will or internal strength to really eradicate ISKP. And ISKP really has a track record on trying to do attacks in the West.
Brief question for brief answer. Is there a chance that either of these organizations, ISIS or Al-Qaeda, poses any kind of threat to launch an attack in the West and specifically in the United States at this stage?
Oh, they're very much working on it, but in a different way than we traditionally think about this. So when we say ISIS is attacking the West, we are thinking of an organized attack, biggest one, 9/11, smaller one, the Paris attacks in November 2015. We think of a very organized, sophisticated terror attack. At the moment, none of these affiliates seems to have, for the time being, the willingness or ability to do that. I would also argue they don't see the need to do that because they are consistently and continuously trying to inspire individuals to prepare attacks that are already living here. So not sent, not trained in some training camps, but people who want to do something. We have a very recent example here in Germany where the Islamic State didn't have to do anything. They just put out their propaganda, and these groups, these two individuals, so brothers of Syrian descent, who were arrested, were preparing an attack on Swedish churches as a result of the Quran burning in front of the Turkish embassy a couple of weeks ago. If your listeners have heard that, in this spat about NATO membership, the tone gets rougher between Sweden and Turkey, and some Swedish right-wing extremists burned a Quran in front of the Turkish embassy. In that alone, with the inspired propaganda that these guys had consumed, was enough for them to prepare a very serious attack, and they're now in prison in Germany. So that's what's going on already. So terrorism has, in its methodology when it comes to over-the-horizon attacks, shifted slightly. We may come back to these high-level, sophisticated attacks, but I guess what I see what these organizations are doing, they've learned that our ability to monitor increases considerably the risks of being detected. So the more complicated the attacks, the more elements they have to have, the more people that need to be involved, the higher the risk that it's actually going to be detected right now. We are no longer at the beginning of the 2000s. But having a knife attack or a small bomb attack every couple of weeks is, as we've seen in France, pretty much as effective.
That was the next thing that I was going to get to. France, do you see what happened with the attack on the children this week?
Yes.
Do you see that as a terror attack?
Well, the jury is still out. The French are still investigating, but obviously, I mean, he very purposefully knifed down a lot of kids, right? So, yes, of course, he has mental problems. Any terrorist has mental, I keep pointing this out. Mental problems doesn't mean he's not a terrorist. There is no stable individual, otherwise the individual wouldn't be a terrorist, right? So it's just a question of what was the motivation. Is he just crazy or did he have an ideological agenda, right?